Good evening. Can you hear me? Yes. Tonight, it's introduce Wayland resident Ian Condry, professor of Japanese cultural studies at MIT. Professor Condry is a cultural anthropologist and has been at MIT since 2002. He is the author of 2 books, Hip Hop Japan and The Soul of Anime, both of which examine how cultural movements go global from below. He is currently working on a book exploring music and musicians after the end of the recording industry with a comparison of Tokyo, Boston, and Berlin. He's the founder of the Dissolve Music Series and organizer of the MIT Spatial Sound Lab, which makes multi-perspective sonic experiences to explore the possibilities of sound for transforming learning and democracy. He also hosts the radio show Near and Far on WMBR. This is a lecture about sound. That's funny. This is not working. 88.1 FM Cambridge and online WMBR. Just a quick note, this presentation is being recorded by Waycam, so the back of your head will be viewable on their channel and YouTube. But thank you so much to Professor Condry for sharing his work with us tonight, and please join me in welcoming him to the library.
Thank you, Christine, for that lovely introduction. Let's see. This doesn't look so good. Let's try this. That's not going to work. This is backwards. Here we go. All right, good. Is this on? It is on? Okay, good. I can't hear it too well. Okay, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Christine, for that lovely introduction. Thank you, Steve, for organizing. And thank you all for being here. This is a new area of research for me, so I'm eager to hear any feedback you have, any ideas. The book is just underway, but there's sort of new ideas that I'm working on and thinking about sound. How can sound teach us to learn differently? I've been in the teaching business now for almost 20 years. And I'm struck by all the ways we could do better jobs as teachers, as educational institutions. And I think some of the things I've learned from thinking about the power of sound has helped me rethink the possibilities for learning as well. And what about democracy, the challenges in our politics today? Are there ways we can learn from sound to rethink what we imagine democracy to be? Obviously, it's much more than just voting. It's much more than our political leaders. We have a bit of a crisis in terms of our dialogue among our fellow Americans. It seems to me learning to listen in new ways might help us overcome some of these current challenges. And I even want to suggest that listening is better than looking. We live in a visual age. It's Instagram, it's Netflix, it's the screen in our pockets. But maybe it's time for us to close our eyes and listen and think about the power of learning by hearing. Okay, and to start us off, I thought, well, we should start with a test. So let's start with a little test, allowing us to experience what it would be like to learn through sound. So here's a simple test. It's taken from a Rainforest sound walk by an anthropologist called Stephen Feld. He's an anthropologist of music and sound. And he did a lot of study among the Kaluli people in the Bosavi Rainforest, about 3,000 feet up in the hills of Papua New Guinea. It's an interesting rainforest area, and he recorded a lot of singing, a lot of human interaction, but he also found out that the songs that they sing are inspired by the birds and the sounds of the forest, and that their social worlds are modeled on what they hear. And the songs they sing are actually generally references to places and people within a forest. And so the sound of the forest and the social relationships are complexly intertwined. And to try to give a sense of that, he recorded some of these sound walks. What does the rainforest sound like at different times of the day? So that's your test. We're going to play 3 samples of music here. One's the morning, one's the afternoon, and one's nighttime. And your job is to guess which is which. Okay? I'll give you the answers afterwards. You can take notes if you need to. Here's the first sound test. Is this morning, afternoon, or night? hold your answers. Second sample, morning, afternoon, or night. Okay, and the kicker. Sample 3, morning, afternoon, or night. Okay, I don't have the key, but I remember the answer. You ready? Here it goes. That was afternoon, night, and then morning. All right. How many people got all 3 correct? Okay, very good. How many people got 2 correct? All right, how many people got 1 correct? How many people got none? All right, very interesting, very interesting. So one of the things I think is interesting about this is that for a child, maybe even a trivial test, ridiculous, why do you even test it? It's so obvious. And yet, this is not the kind of learning we do. This is not the way we learn in our schools. We don't have these sound tests very often. I suppose it's possible. You can imagine some things. But it reminds us that in this time in which we're internet connected and we have all of this information and we look down on these impoverished people in the rainforest, that in fact they have knowledge. They have understanding that we don't. And in fact that we've almost lost in our society the ability to hear the difference in forest sounds of morning, noon, and night. Okay, so what I'd like to suggest is that there's a lot of things we can learn out there that we're not teaching and we're not learning from. In fact, there are certainly some people who have these kinds of skills who could do this very well, but that's not tested on the SATs. That's not tested in class. So there are ways in which sound offers a different entree and a different perspective on the world. And I think that's important because we're living in a time where our economy is changing, where we're moving from an industrial, object-oriented economy to a service, knowledge, experience, and culture economy. And it means a shift from value based on objects to value that's more about experiences and value that's based on how we spend our time rather than how many things we own. And it seems to me what this means, and this is sort of the main argument of the talk, is that we need to shift from an understanding of the social economic world as a kind of flatland of economic exchange to a world that's constantly curved, where our social world is always warped by power, by attraction, by different ways of seeing the world around us. I'll give you another example. I teach in Japan sometimes. I spent a little time teaching on the JET program years ago, where I was an assistant English teacher in a junior high school class. And one of the interesting things about the beginning of class in a junior high school in Japan was I would come in, and there'd be the real teacher. I was just the assistant teacher. But we'd come in. There'd be a little 6-inch stage. We'd stand. We'd shuffle our papers for a little while. And when we were ready to go, we wouldn't do anything. We wouldn't say anything. It was one of the students' job in the class to notice that we were ready. And that student would have to say, oh, they're ready. And they would say, okay, stand up. Okay, so let's try this. Please, I'd like everybody to stand up. Okay, press stand up. And then they'd say, Ray. And Ray means bow. So we'll try this, okay? Everybody bow. Okay, good. That was terrible. Okay, acceptable at all, even for 7th graders. And the reason is that we're the teachers. We're the teachers, so we bow. You have to be longer, deeper than us, the respected people. So here's a little rule, okay? If you're bowing to somebody more powerful than you or more important than you, you go about 2 o'clock. There is a sort of 3 o'clock. That's overdoing it. 1 o'clock if you're sort of important. I was less important than the teacher, but more important than the students. So I was about 1:30. And so let's try it again. So you have to, and also you have to avert your eyes, but you still have to notice that if I'm still bowing, you stay down. Okay, ready? Here we go. Ray. Okay, very good, very good, very good. Okay, all right, thank you very much. Excellent, much better, much better, much better. So what's interesting about this This is an example of the ways that we curve our social space. In fact, we mark this power dynamic between me and the other teacher, between us and the students, through this control of our body in certain ways. And red, it's part of the language of power and authority and importance in Japan. It's very interesting and very powerful. And it reminds us that there are different ways in which we operate in this world, and that there are all kinds of different possibilities for how our culture, our societies can be organized. And I think this is important because people say, you can't change capitalism. We may have a difficult capitalism, rising inequality, not tackling climate change, leading to imperialist wars all over the world. You can't do anything about it. It's capitalism. Besides, communism's no good. It's not fun. It's not interesting. So might there be a model for a social economy that respects diversity? And I would point to the record companies. The record industry used to be the center of gravity for the musicians in the music world, but the record industry is dissolving. It's coming back a little bit with streaming, but basically what used to be the main business of musicians, which is making recordings and getting rich off a hit record, is no longer the way to go. So in fact, music today is this really fascinating natural experiment, or I would say social experiment, in the different possibilities for how music and musicians can make a living. Okay? Because it is a challenge, and part of the challenge is music is free now, as this song says.
Everything is free now. That's what they say. Everything I ever done, gonna give it away. Someone hit the big score, figured it out. They were gonna do it anyway, even if it doesn't pay.
I mean, I like this song. It was written by Gillian Welch and Dave Rawlings back a couple years after Napster emerged, remade again more recently by a duo, Sylvan Esso, and a singer who calls herself Flock of Dimes. And it captures the anger of musicians at feeling betrayed by their fans, that people will no longer pay for their music, and their musicians are being told, well, you just have to give it away. They say, this is my life, this is what I've done. I'm going to work for you, and you're telling me I have to do it for free. We're in a transition moment, and it's not unique to musicians. Lots of jobs are disappearing now, and people are being told, well, it's too bad for you. It's not okay. How can we understand the new possibilities are out there? And it's important because it's related to broader changes in the economy as well. If you look at what happened, this is another reminder that capitalism is not a single thing. From the post-war period up till about late 70s, early 80s, our productivity was growing, but so were wages. Wages for the typical worker were increasing at the same rate. We probably know this now. It's becoming more widely known. But something happens around 1980. Okay? This is Reaganomics. This is Margaret Thatcher. This is Yasuhiro Nakasone. It's a privatization of public works. It's a change in the tax structures. It's a new era in which the wealth is not shared. If we look at the share of income as it's gone from 1979, we see huge growth in the top 1% and relatively flat for everyone else. Okay, and now what's interesting, so I'm a cultural anthropologist. That means we start with culture, with what people think things mean. How do people organize their lives by different touchstones, different things that have meaning? I think this is important because people say, well, that's culture, but the economy, it's its own thing. You know, it's, you cultural anthropologists look at the fluff on top, but us economists, we look at the real base of our society. And I'd like to argue that I don't think that's true, because in many ways, Americans don't even know how out of whack our economy is. It's an interesting study. Dan Ariely, I forget Norton's name, Michael Norton, interesting economics professors who people, what is the distribution of wealth in America? Let's divide it up by quintiles. 20%, 20%, 20%, 20%, 20%. How much does each person have? And people would draw lines. 5,000 Americans they interviewed. They draw lines. They averaged everything. And this is what they came up with. And they showed, here's the actual distribution of wealth. For the top 20%, We have more than 80% of the wealth. Second 20%, almost 20%. Third 20%, maybe 8%. The fourth and fifth, the bottom 20%, this is actually not true. You can't even see the line. In fact, many of them are in debt. But Americans think, well, they know it's out of whack, but they're not quite close to what it actually is. And they say, well, what should it be? They say, well, some wealthy people should be more wealthy, but it shouldn't be that skewed. Now, this is a cultural issue because also if you ask Americans, hey, do you want to live in Sweden? They say, no! I know, shout out to Sweden over here. They say, no, all those taxes, that'd be terrible. But then they say, well, but actually this is Sweden, right here. Or at least it's more like here what Americans think it is. So there's a disconnect. There's a cultural disconnect that leads to a misunderstanding of how our economy works and what's going on. Okay? And it plays in all sorts of different ways. Another thing that we've had from Tom Piketty, the growth of billionaires has been phenomenal. Tenfold increase in the number of billionaires in the world. People say, one of the crazy statistics out there is if you put the 60 richest people on a bus, a Greyhound bus, not that they'd get on, but if they were on a Greyhound bus, they would have more wealth than half the planet. 60 people. Okay, things are so out of whack that it's hard to know what to do with it. And it seems to me that if you think about this, you say, well, wait a minute. That means that there's a lie on the basis of all the economic statistics. And that lie is that a dollar equals a dollar. When half the planet lives on less than $6 a day, $1 for half the people who live on this planet is a lot of money. Okay, but for one of these billionaires, it's not worth anything. It's not even worth counting. Okay. It's almost as if we need a kind of social economic equalizer. Bring down the rich, bring up the base. Something like that. Try to change a little bit how things go. Okay? How do we do that? How do we think about that? How do we look for new opportunities and new ideas in the world? Well, part of it, I think, means for us social theorists, for us academic types, that we need to change our theory so that it acknowledges that there's this curvature. There's this curvature, this warp and to our social world that's all around us. Okay? And we see the emergence of some of this when we have people talking about class discrimination, right? Implicit bias. These are all ways of trying to talk about how, as a white old man with glasses looking like a professor walking down the street, I'm treated like a man wearing a do-rag, a Latino woman bringing along her 4 kids. It's a different world out there. And yet, too much of our economic data, our ideas of politics, brush over this as if one person has one vote and $1 equals $1. That's why I want to suggest that we think about, well, what is this curvature? How can we understand our social world in terms of a kind of curvature? Well, the way actual curvature of space-time works, okay, this is Einstein. It pulls on the Earth, and so as the Earth is going around, it pulls on the Earth to keep it in. And Einstein says this can't be. What the sun is doing is it's curving space. Gravity curves space, and the Earth is actually moving in a straight line, falling in a straight line through curves. Okay, this is the kind of image I thought, it's very interesting. This is like our world. This is the way we move crowd. That there's a kind of pressure, attractive and repulsive pressure that moves among us. But what would it be if we're talking about social economic space-time? Well, the obvious cultural studies answer, if you've got money, it curves social space around you. Money is out for. But there's other things as well. What about love? Use these gravitational terms of attraction to talk about how we interact with other people. And that can be about money, but mostly it's not about money. If you're a musician, what else are you attracted to? You try to find, a bar with good sound, a system with really nice speakers. Like I had to bring my own speaker just in case. I wanted a bigger speaker, a little subwoofer, something. Okay, so good sounds. What about an audience? Yeah, an audience. Be people that attractive to me as a speaker. But there's more than that as well. And one might say, well, wait a minute. Einstein has one gravity. You obviously got like 5, 6 gravity. We have intersecting and cross-cutting fields of force, gravitational fields, electromagnetic, and so on. So it's possible that we could have different kinds of curvatures still using this metaphor. And I think this is useful because the future is here. The possibilities out there for our future are already happening now, many of them. And so this idea is from William Gibson, science fiction writer. The future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. So what could we learn from music and sound to get different ideas about how to alter this distribution? And so this is the project that Christina kindly mentioned. Musicians after the end of the recording industry, and I'm interested in comparing different kinds of phenomena to see, well, how do they work? What are the social relations? What are the economic relations? What are the power relations? And how can we get different understandings of the world? So among the things, oh, that's pretty small. Okay, well, anyway, music festivals, live shows, pop idols I'll talk about briefly. Crowdfunding as an interesting, possibly post-capitalist idea. Crowdsourced virtual idols, I don't think we're getting to that today, and a little bit about experimental sound. Okay, and then in sort of each of these spaces and looking at music, I study music in Japan, you can see ideas of the future, different ways of viewing the world that might be inspiration for us moving forward. My first book was about Japanese hip-hop, so I have to play some Japanese hip-hop for you. In fact, here, now that I think of it, it's a song by Yayoi Daimon. There she is, Yayoi Daimon. It's Oko Gorilla. Features rapper Oko Gorilla. It's a song from last year called No Bra. Let's check this out for a minute and a half here. How do I do view full screen? Where's video full screen? All right. So here, let me just get back over here. So interesting kind of thing. I mean, especially for hip hop, which is seen generally as this masculinist, macho kind of world, that it can also be a space for the free the nipple movement, right? To say this binding of women in terms of their bras is control. And patriarchal control, and not something that one needs to do. Okay, whoops. Oh, let's see here. Let's try that. That should work. And there's gay rap in Japan as well. Nishi Shinjuku Panties. They're out there. they're rappers and they wear panties on their head while they rap. Sort of just a different style, just to say, hey, there's different forms of masculinity out there, and one of their songs is, the tougher you are, the more you wear a panty on your head. This one is Asu ni mukai kabore. It means, let's face tomorrow wearing panties. And so it's kind of interesting. Anyway, that's another idea. And you know, it is this space where this kind of artwork points to double standards and points to ways in which men and women are viewed totally differently, where there is a curvature depending on whether you're a man or a woman, and how you can deal with these intimate things. So for example, there's this fascinating artist. She's a sculptor and a manga comic book artist, Rokutan Oko. And her artwork that has actually gotten her in trouble, but her artwork is to make silicon molds of her vagina, there it is, and make little dioramas out of them. So the obscene word in Japanese is manko. So this would be, she calls them deco-man, so it's your decorating, your manko, deco-man. And here's this is soldier man right here. She has a little golf man one too, they're playing golf. And it's very cute, very funny. It wasn't that big a thing, actually. She wasn't getting famous, actually, on this. But she said, you know, I like this, but I'd like to make something big, a big sculpture. So then she learned about 3D printing, 3D scanning. She said, but I don't have money for that. So she did a Kickstarter campaign with the desire to make a kayak, a manko kayak, using her own manko there. Here she went on Kickstarter. She was able to scan and to print, and she went out kayaking on Balls River, Tama River in Japan. It was great. There was like 15 people there, nice little thing. But then she got arrested. She got arrested and thrown in jail for obscenity. Okay, she got arrested and thrown in jail because if you gave money to this project, for a week she made available the possibility of downloading this 3D data. It's actually not clear that anybody ever did download the 3D data. Certainly no minors downloaded it, but still it was seen as distributing obscene materials. She was thrown in jail, threatened, harassed, but she found some people who supported her, and she's been fighting the case in court. She's not in jail. She was in jail for about 3 weeks, but still 3 weeks. And it's working its way through the court. This is her celebrating her one acquittal on one of the charges, and the other charge is still working its way through the courts. She wrote a lovely comic book about it called What is Obscenity that's quite fascinating. Now you might say, well, you know, that's the Japanese, you know, they're touchy genitals. They don't want, you know, you're not supposed to have genitals in the comic books and the movies, so it's probably just it's a Japanese genital thing. Turns out that's not true. Because there is a fertility festival at Kanamura where you can march around with a giant pink penis, turns out. Not only that, but on the comedians, on talk shows, they can joke about their penises, they can use the word penis, that's okay. But women's genitalia is reserved for male sexual pleasure. That's the logic of it. And any other uses risk taking away some of that. All right, my apologies if this was anyway, here it is. This is the curvature of space-time. That's what we're talking about. So what it reminds us, so these are some musical, some sculpture, some art examples, but it reminds us that the diversity of culture and things out there is quite wide. And it's also true for the music industry, that the music industry is not just recordings. But there's all these different kinds of ways that these industries can unfold. And Japan is actually a fascinating example of that because we've seen these huge changes in the industry, right? I call it the end of the recording industry, but it's only the end of the dominance of the recording industry. It's not the end entirely of recordings or their value. But look at this interesting difference. In Japan, 2015, recorded music is still the bulk of sales, whereas in the US it was only about 30%. You go ahead a year, now streaming, this is still 2016, it's gone even more than this. Now most of the money comes from streaming, very little, still shrinking of digital downloads and physical sales. Well, what about Japan? Probably catching up, right? So the next year in Japan, change. Okay, you say, wow. And I've seen this written about. It's like, oh, those Japanese, they're so behind the times. You know, they're just going to catch up to streaming eventually. You say, well, know, why are people still buying CDs in Japan? It's probably the last country in the world where people are buying CDs. And the answer is that the pop idols figured out a way to sell CDs when you don't care about the music. Music is, in fact, free, but these CDs have a value that's different than music. And so, for example, you have this band AKB48. Akihabara is this sort of otaku geek area of Japan. And the guy who created this group said, you know, the problem with idols is you never get to meet them. You only see them on TV or in magazines. So I want to make a live idol, an idol you can go see. They have daily shows in Akihabara. You could shake hands with the idols, actually touch them after the show. There were all these different things he had to do to try to move the idols around and get them in front and back. He has a cafe shop there right now, and they became huge. So huge that they would have these giant elections. They called them the general election in Tokyo Dome, the largest coliseum in Tokyo, where which was started as about 16, 18 young women singing, now has 10 of these groups spread around Japan and even a little bit in China and Indonesia. And they move the girls around. They move them around. And that if you want your idol that you support to stay in the front of the famous group, the group you want them to be in, you need to vote for them. And one CD is one vote. And people are famous for buying 10,000 CDs so they can vote for their one person, spending all the hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy CDs. They have a chance to go to this concert. Right, and so you vote with buying these CDs. You can vote for the center, collect photos, ticket access, handshake events. They even have a rival group that's by the same company, but they pretend it's the rival group. And here's an advertisement for the rival group saying, here's the different women, and you should choose. See, they're all designed to look a little different, have a little different attitude. And if you buy your CDs, you can vote for which of the 7 will appear in the video, in the front of the video. So you choose yours, you support yours. It's a nice kind of fight it out. Fight it out as consumerism. Okay? This is one end of the future of music capitalism. But there's other directions as well. One of the examples I'm quite interested in is Amanda Palmer. She's started out here in Boston, I think grew up in Lexington. And she has made this very interesting career of using crowdfunding to get support. And she has her patrons through Patreon. You can choose how much you give per thing. She usually releases about 3 things per month. $1, $3, whatever you want to give. You get sort of different levels of attention depending on how much you give in. And it's quite interesting. And I would say it's post-capitalism, okay? But in a kind of maybe a narrower sense than people often think. It's post-capitalism. What makes capitalism distinctive is this funneling of the money from labor, right? As we saw productivity increasing, but typical wages staying flat. It's because capitalism is increasingly funneling that extra labor up to this capitalist class, okay? A really narrow stream at the very top of our financial world. Okay, so this is post-capitalism in the sense that people are putting in money, but what they expect out is not more money. They're expecting out a social relationship, a social experience. And so in that sense, although there's money, I think of post-capitalism not as an end to money, not as an end to prices, but as a slowing down and hopefully a slight reversal of this funneling of most of the wealth, of the work that goes into our productivity of our economy, that gets spread downwards a little bit more. Okay? So anyway, I think it's an interesting example of other possibilities. I'm also quite fascinated by these small, tiny clubs. If AKB and these giant festivals are one end of the music world, what about these small clubs? And one of these small clubs I go to is called Bonobo in Tokyo. It holds about 15 people comfortably. I've seen 40 people in there. It's way too crowded. But it's interesting because they get the top DJs to play there. Why would they go there? And partly it's because it's the DJ's DJ bar. This is where you go to hear new music and hear new experimentation. So the audience is very interesting. It's great sound design as well. The guy has made his own mixer, his own speakers. The sound is really remarkable how he has it tuned. And it allows for this kind of networking with other artists. That's the value of going to this place. It's not a monetary value, it's a networking value that comes out of it. And the owner of it, Koichi Sei-san, he says it's modeled on a home party. He says this is supposed to be like a home party. And it has a little upstairs, little balcony area even, where you can go around and experience different rooms in the club. He does this sound design too, where the speakers in the back of the club are designed to have a slight delay. So it sounds like the echo is coming in a room that's much larger, actually, than the room is. It's kind of interesting. You can't hear it, but you would notice it if it wasn't there. And he also designs this space in a way that people can talk. He says, the point of going out to hear music is that you can spend time with your friends and meet new people and talk to them, not have to shout over the music and get a headache from it being too loud. And so he's designed a social space for interaction. That it too is a kind of attractive power between the great audience, the great sound, and the ability to interact with other people. Okay. And this is what I mean about learning by sound. Okay? That we can take these different examples of sound and making livelihoods to imagine what it's like in other ways. And the music is this kind of repetitive techno that you can listen to or not listen to. It doesn't matter. It's also designed in a certain way that you can talk over it. It tends to be a lot of bass and a lot of high end, but it leaves the middle frequencies rather empty because that's where our vocal range is. Kind of interesting, I think. A last example. What's the future? Again, is there a future for sound that could be interesting and surprising and let us experience things in new ways? And I got turned on to this idea of a spatial mix by this band called Mouse on Mars. Here they are, kind of kooky guys, Jan and Andy, based in Berlin. I met Jan because he was teaching at MIT for a little while, and he invited me to check out his studio. I went, and it was very. And he said, "Oh yeah, you know, you should come check us out. We're going to mix our new album in a spatial mix." I was like, "What's a spatial mix? I don't even know what that means." He said, "Yeah, you got to come check it out." So I was like, "Good, I'm on leave. I'm an anthropologist. That means I have to do field work." So I had to go do field work at the Spatial Mix Recording Studio, DNB Audio in Backnang, Germany. They have this new technology called the Soundscape that Mouse on Mars brought a lot of this material. They recorded all sorts of material from their various friends in the music world, and they wanted to remix it in various ways. And so they brought it to this space. This is what it looks like in Backnang, Germany, a large room at their factory, maybe 40 speakers around the edges, a bunch of subwoofers in the front and the back, and a mixing table right in the middle. And what this allows you to do is take the different sounds and place them around the room. And here's Jan talking a little bit about this experience.
We recorded Zach Condon, actually he's he is the band Beirut, more or less. And he came to the studio here, Berlin, and we recorded voice parts and then chopped them up and processed them. And then this we took to Eau Claire, where we had the session Annie just described. And then we took all these sessions back to Berlin, reworked everything, added new elements, and then we had so much material that we didn't know how to mix it. And then the idea came we would make a spatial mix. So object-based mixing was a thing that we learned through DNB, the speaker company. We learned about this technique when we knew about the idea of spatial mixing, but DNB really pushed it quite far, this technology, and now have a system which they also tested with the recent Kraftwerk shows that actually spatializes sounds. You don't have a stereo perspective anymore, you can walk around in sound. And this is what we always wanted, not stand and watch the sound, but really have the experience of being inside it. And it doesn't matter if it's only one sound or if it's like the whole composition. We thought this would be perfect for all that material that we had collected. You put sounds wherever you want, and this is how you organize it. You don't stuff them all into one hamburger, but you kind of leave it like more like a sushi buffet, like fresh. And with our music, this made sense.
A sushi buffet. But it is this idea of sort of designing, taking sounds and placing them around the room. Here's a close-up of what it looks like, and all these different sounds so that you could walk inside the composition. And there was no single song, that in fact everybody experienced the song somewhat differently. And I think what's interesting about this, to get back to the theme of teaching and learning, is that this is a much better model of what it's like to try to learn in the world outside of school. Okay, school teaches us a very limited approach to learning. Look at how we're organized here. I made you bow. I'm standing in front. You're sitting. I'm talking. You're quiet. There's all these ways. There's a front screen here. We're all facing the screen. But in fact, the real world is different. We have information coming from all directions. And each of us experiences that information and those interactions somewhat differently. And then we have to piece together a kind of spatialized knowledge. And yet we don't teach this way. We don't have experiences like this enough in school. We sort of experience it later, maybe, but too much of our world is mediated by this thing in front of us, this screen, the podium, the pages of a book, lines of a sentence that unfold narratively in a linear, unidirectional way. So that's what I found so fascinating about the spatial sound, is that it offered different kinds of experiences that were also maybe a better metaphor for learning. The one problem is this system is too fancy. It's too expensive. It's very hard to get access to it. We're trying to set up a community studio at MIT. Hopefully that'll happen shortly. But I think it's more the idea that matters than the technology. So I even made a 4-channel spatial cowboy hat that you could try out. So it's like a Walkman in 4 channels, front and back. Okay. So, all right. So this is the idea. This is another end of or showing the possibilities for learning and democracy. And it reminds us, like these lovely theorists, J.K. Gibson Graham, it's 2 women, but they write under the same pen name. And they want to point out that non-capitalist activities are all around us. And the ways that people are interacting with the world aren't driven only by money. And even this comparison of the variety of ways of thinking about music point to that diversity and approaches and ways that money is part of it, but it's not necessarily the driving force. And so this gets me to the conclusion, to say that learning from sound allows us in some ways to be more sensitive to these curvatures of social space. We can see the invisible. Those rainforest birds that were we in the rainforest, we would never see them. But we can hear them. We can hear things that are even behind us. And that, as we see from these different examples of crowdfunding, even the pop idols or the underground techno club, that there are different ways of interacting, different kinds of sonic collectivities that we can experience through sound. And finally, it seems to me it can help us rethink democracy as well. That democracy isn't just about voting red or blue, but it's getting more voices into the process, right? More dialogue, more spaces. That art can fight against patriarchal curves. That we can have socially aware listening spaces where people can interact and experience an outside world. Oh, I didn't get to mobile protest disco. Well, that'll be for another talk. But space, more voices, like dimensional people, and give us a chance to experience the world in a different way. And it seems to me then, but thinking about sound, we can think of new ways to learn, to experience and participate in democracy, and hopefully work for a better world. Thank you very much. All right, that's it. Let's have a talk. We can discuss now. Now it's talk time. Spatialized discussion, as I call it. Yeah, please.
Hear about that. Oh dear, what was? I'm sorry. Can I see the last page? Mobile protest disco.
So funny you should ask. Okay, well here it is. Mobile disco. Well, we've had some political changes in the country, and then there have been protests of various kinds. And so my colleague here, Gary, you can raise your hand. So Gary and I decided to participate in the protest with a mobile disco unit. There it is. There's our mobile disco. Gary figured out the electricity problem with our generator. I brought my Rocket speakers, a little broken mixer here, a little DJ booth, and then a little DJ player in the computer. And we bring it out. Here you go. That's mobile protest disco. So, yep. Just trying to help out. Just trying to help the process. Bring the disco to the protest. That's been our goal. It's moderately successful, surprisingly, actually. It was a bit of a surprise. But yes, that's mobile disco. And, again, it's kind of interesting, I guess, how it too creates this kind of curvature within the march. We bring the women's marches. We go through Boston or through Cambridge, and there'd be a little sort of a bubble of dancing and disco in the middle of the protest. And it's a little tricky because we turn it down if people start chanting, because we have speakers, we have electricity, so we don't want to sort of overwhelm people who are just trying to chant and do their thing. So we had to learn a kind of etiquette from disco, which was interesting. And people have said, well, doesn't it kind of impinge on people who don't want to hear disco? But we found that we couldn't really keep up with the march anyway, so people would pass by, and so you'd have to try to stay with us. We wouldn't necessarily impose ourselves, and people would go by, and people would hang with us if they wanted to. So it adds another kind of social feeling to the protest that we found kind of interesting. There you go, mobile protest disco.
So the girls in Japan with the chocolate box arrangement,
Yeah.
it seems like they're being exploited, or
Right.
potentially exploited.
Right.
And the ones that
I'm going to
get
sit down if that's
in
okay.
front, they're superstars, and the ones that fall off the end, like,
Right.
too bad, we'll get someone else to come and do.
Right.
It seems kind of open.
I agree.
Not knowing anything other than
No, I agree with you. And in a way, it's kind of remarkable because there's such a desire to be that star,
Yeah,
and I don't know how much it's the girls or the girls' moms or the girls' moms and dads.
I mean, they look young, too.
They are young. They are young. They'll get started at 12, 13, and then it's a kind of 14 to 21 phase, and then they're kicked out, and they're the most exploited. I don't know the most, but one of the very exploitative features of this group is that they also are not allowed to have boyfriends. They must appear virginal and unattached and available for all the fans, and so that's not so great either.
It's funny how the scale is the thing that exposes the, because when it was just one band with 5 or 6 girls,
But when you see 'em
but
all
when you
lined
see
up
it, that's
like a
it's the scale of
matchbox,
it.
yeah, it's like, wow.
Do the girls get any of their money?
Yeah, I think some of them get the ones in the front get rich, and the ones in the front have a chance to be on television shows and get an ad. The real money's in advertising. Turns out that even today, sort of, although the CDs are selling, their breakthrough would be to be in a TV show or advertising. That's where the big money is. Yeah, they're actually singing. I mean, and the singing's not very good, and it's designed actually to not be very good. So that's part of the idol shtick.
And the most audience are men.
They're mostly men here, yes, but there are, the mostly women groups too. I mean, mostly women fan. Mostly young side to that too, and I'm told that those men are also punished for if they have girlfriends or boyfriends. Girlfriends or boyfriends, but they're also again the. Pop idol thing, not a Japan thing. I would totally agree with that.
Yeah, they do that in China too.
Yep.
Movie stars, they marry. They won't let you know. They
Right.
they don't tell people.
question over here first, and then we'll go.
About, I mean, the stuff about the, the top stuff feels like it's, kind of a very manipulative and probably patriarchal to control it.
Mm-hmm.
But the protest stuff that you're talking about feels, and the musicians that are doing things novel and new and seeking, Kickstarter fund, that sounds like it's really a very different kind of a process. And my question there is, how does any of that really get to scale so that it can actually become not just counter-revolution, revolutionary micro, but how does it really become embedded in the cultural ecology of all society?
Great question. It's hard to say. I guess is the honest answer. That would be the honest answer. But yeah, I know exactly. So, yeah, so that's a good question. And one of the things I would say, and it's an argument I took from them, but they point out, and I agree, that of our world that are one of the things I would point to, for example, is raising a family. That raising a family is something that humans have done without capitalism for a few 100,000 years before we got to capitalism. And that, so I think one of our things is that we are now interpreting, well, unless you have money, that idea is not true. We can tell historically it's not true. But we live in a world where we become accustomed to interpreting things through the lens of money and seeing money as the base of things. And I just, even when I look at musicians, when I look at teachers, when I look at parents, children, you can think of churches. It's not a capitalist principle. Okay, so so part of the idea is to start looking around and saying, well, in fact, maybe this is not all, look at public libraries. Wayland Free Library, right? I mean, this could be regarded as book piracy, right? If this were films, if these were DVDs, well, you can even get DVDs. But one could interpret this as piracy as downloading. No, it's a public service. A society needs to have this stuff be free. So I actually think there's less control of capitalism, and I guess that's It used to be huge. I remember those days myself, and it was Yoyogi Park, and they called it Rokutan, which was short for pedestrian paradise. They would close off the streets, and there were the Elvis Presley-looking guys in their boots and blue jean jackets, and then there were the Takeko who were in these outrageous kimono costumes. And those are the two of the dancing styles, but there were all these music bands out there. So no, they shut it down. The government shut it down. They said it got too noisy, too out of control, and you can still go there. There's still a few. They call them rock and rollers, the Elvis Presley looking women. This men and women. Women are sort of bobby socks and sock hop outfits, and there's still a little of that going on. They're getting a little older. But they're still doing it. But yeah, it is interesting. I think it's an interesting example of a space for music that's increasingly hard to find. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, please.
How do you see the U.S. music industry growing from an anti or non-commercial basis and still having the
I think it's going to depend on us fans developing new relationships and new approaches. And part of it could be crowdfunding. Part of it could be us deciding to pay for things that we didn't used to pay for. I mean, that's what crowdfunding is a little bit, is she gets the money and then she can make the album. Used to be you sign with the record label, they give you the money, and then they take their cut. And as long as you make more than they put in, then you can keep making albums. But if you don't, then you kind of are in debt to the record company forever, was the old style. So it wasn't a perfect, it was an okay style if you were really successful, but it was a disastrous style for people who couldn't make back that initial investment. And so it was, you know, it wasn't necessarily the good old days, but it did solve a certain problem of how you got some financing to the bands initially. That's the piece we're missing right now in this world. It's gotten much cheaper to make things. That's good. Everybody can do it on a computer. The expensive studios are much more easy to set up and not as expensive now. But we need a shift. We need a shift in ways that musicians, and frankly, lots of people who provide wonderful, socially valuable services, we need to find out how to support those people. You know, I dream of the day when we look down the street and say, wow, how'd that woman get a Porsche to drive around? You say, don't you know? She's an elementary school teacher. Don't you know? She's a home health aide. Of course, she's a daycare worker. Daycare, oh my God, that's the hardest job on the planet. Of course she should be rich, right? And so you can imagine a world in which who gets rewarded for what it's that social economic equalizer, right? And you know, we hear it in Sanders and Warren, and we hear it in the election talk right now. I mean, how are we going to do it? What are the practical ways to make that happen? First is to recognize that it needs to happen, I guess, and then second is to find the political will to do it, which means us, right? Us protesting and demanding it at some level. So it's not necessarily simple, but what these examples remind us is they're not fantasy examples either. The future is here already. It's happening. And there's the negative exploitation of young underage women direction, and then there's the, you know, crowdfunding. We'll support you, Amanda. We believe in your project. Let's do this, and we'll do this together. And so all those possibilities are battling it out right now. And I think it's a little bit on us. I think it's not enough for us to say those companies have to change. We also have to say, well, what could I do? How could I make this a little bit different? And even like buying, and another sort of interesting example is, so there's iTunes to pay for and download music, or there's Bandcamp to pay for and download music. One thing that happens on Bandcamp is that on average, people pay 20% more than the asking price. Okay, I don't know a lot of economic exchange moments where you're given a price and you say, you know what, I'm gonna pay a little more than that. I'll just pay more than that. I want this person to have more. But it's happening right now on Bandcamp, and so it's, you know, it's possible. It's possible for us to say, hey, look, I'm rich now. I gotta put a little bit more back into the kitty, and I can do that. I can afford that, and it's important to me. It's possible, and it's even happening.
So the analogy might be to right now the money goes up to the, you know.
Right. This narrow, super rich class. That's right.
Rich, but you know, the analogy of say sports fandom. You know, all the money goes to the NFL, and then the NFL splits it out to the teams, and they make, you know, everybody's making a lot of money, and it's filtering down to the players. Essentially. And if you were to democratize that process, so that the fans were not necessarily giving their money to the, you know, the central capitalist infrastructure, but were instead giving the money to the players,
Right.
it would be an entirely different structure.
Right. And especially if then you filter all that money down and through, you know, down through the system, and say, you know, without these farm teams, without all these youth soccer people out there, we wouldn't have the top players, you know, and it makes sense logically, but it's not worked into our economic system yet. But it could be. You can imagine it.
Yeah, imagine if fantasy football was the thing where if you had these guys on your team and you put a certain amount in, then they got a certain cut.
They
Because you think about all the people that play fantasy football, I mean, it's a big number.
Nice. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it. Please come back for more of the Great Presenter series. I'm a little embarrassed by the title, but okay.